This program is made possible by a grant from the Upjohn Company, a worldwide research-based provider of human healthcare products and services. Methought I heard a voice cry, "Sleep no more. Macbeth doth murder sleep, the innocent sleep, sleep that knits up the raveled sleeve of care, the death of each day's life, sore labor's bath, balm of hurt minds, great nature's second course, chief nourisher in life's feast." Those are the words of William Shakespeare in his play, Macbeth. He was describing sleep, one of the most compelling mysteries in human life. From our earliest beginnings, we have been fascinated by sleep, that nightly retreat that separates us from the waking world. Our art, literature, and science reflect our continued efforts to understand the mysteries that surround sleep. We were challenged to try and discover what sleep was and what occurred in our brains and bodies during the time spent away from wakefulness. Today, the secrets of sleep yield themselves to the inquiring minds of research scientists, armed with the tools of modern science, and still there is more to learn and more to understand. Our program is about sleep. During the next hour, we will look at many of the issues that are considered important to our understanding of sleep. We will look at what happens when we are deprived of sleep. We will examine the biological clock and see how it impacts our waking lives. We will journey through the world of dreams and try and learn something of their origins and of the purposes they serve. And we will take an in-depth look at the fascinating subject of sleep disturbance, cause and cure, and examine such serious sleep disorders as narcolepsy and sleep apnea. Dr. William Dement, professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Stanford University, believes that sleep is one of the most important and dynamic areas of current scientific research.
This is probably the most exciting period of time for sleep research in that regard, that new techniques are available at every level to study the brain, and these are great problems. What does the sleeping brain do? What is sleep for? Why do we sleep? What's the sleeping brain doing? What are the multiplicity of activities? It's no more rational to say the brain turns off than you have a concept that the liver, you fall asleep and the liver just turns off. Doesn't do anything. No, those cells are all alive, and they're alive 24 hours a day, and they're doing something 24 hours a day, and it's our job to find out what that is.
The importance of sleep can best be understood when we look at the effects of sleep deprivation on the young. Dr. Mary Carskaden, Brown University, Rhode Island.
My sense is that virtually every adolescent needs at least one more hour of sleep at night than they're getting. And there are probably a significant proportion, 20-30% or more, who are getting 2 hours less than they need, or even 3 hours less than they need. And I think if you look at the kinds of reports they're giving, sleeping 6 hours a night, going to bed at midnight, getting up at 6 to go to school, is just not enough sleep for these adolescents.
When I don't get sleep, I feel drowsy.
When I don't get enough sleep, I seem to get irritable.
Sometimes it almost torments me, like if I don't get enough sleep.
Well, it doesn't make me feel like I'm performing as good as I should, and I always tell myself that tonight I'll get more sleep.
Some of the common consequences of self-restricting sleep that we see in adolescents are really those that we're all familiar with. They fall asleep in classes. You can't learn when you're asleep. Sleep learning is a big myth. It doesn't happen. Maybe you sleep till noon on Sundays and Saturdays. How many of you sleep till 1 on Saturdays and Sundays? In college, students are more likely to admit that it's a problem. And in part, I think they can get by and they can cope, and that's part of the whole issue.
On Sunday night of this week, I was preparing for an exam and I slept a total of an hour and a half. And then on Monday night, I pulled an all-nighter for another exam. The exam was from 9 to 12, and midway through it, I suddenly realized that I was sleeping and I was in an exam and shouldn't be doing that. I just snapped up and started taking the exam again.
Do you think your performance was affected?
Probably.
The human organism is extremely adaptable, and the best thing it does is cope. And these kids, by and large, are coping very well with, for some of them, a very, very significant sleep debt. And so these kids will not get enough sleep. They restrict their sleep. And it's not that they have insomnia and can't sleep. It's that they don't. The other consequences, again, are more subtle. The inability to study, to stay awake while studying, the risks, the vulnerabilities to falling asleep driving these cars that they're working so hard to support. And those get compounded with such things as a couple of beers. Can make a sleepy adolescent a drunk driver. Can make a sleepy person of any age a drunk driver, even with a relatively low blood alcohol level.
So if you're sleepy, you have to recognize you're going to have a real intolerance to a lot of things. Okay, so partying on a weekend when you've only slept X number of hours during the week is very dangerous. Taking even one drink at that point in time may be enough to totally intoxicate you and put you at serious risk of having an accident. And that's true not only for alcohol, but other medication. When you take half of the blood alcohol level, or even a third of that, and you add on top of that sleep restriction, and you have a highly, highly impaired person. And that's a very important concept. In fact, many segments of our society who drink a lot, or who drink to some extent, are also sleep deprived. College students, or young people, for example, have huge alcohol-related car accident rates.
Each of us, at one time or another, has been deprived of sleep. Among the most common causes of sleep deprivation are changes in that complex mechanism we call the biological clock. Dr. Charles A. Seisler, Harvard Medical School.
We live on a periodic planet. That is to say, we're subjected to external cycles in light and darkness, in humidity and temperature. Every day, all of our experience is a highly periodic one. The rotation of the Earth is mainly what generates that periodic cyclicity of our external environment. And over the millennia, organisms have adapted to that periodicity and have generated their own internal systems for predicting when the sun is going to come up and predicting when the sun is going to go down, so that they could evolutionarily adapt to the great changes that we're exposed to at different times of day in our external environment. It was first discovered about 250 years ago by a French astronomer that organisms themselves had an internal clock which predicted how the Earth was going to change at different times of day. And the way he did that was to study a plant. It was thought that the sun was what made the leaves of plants open up, and then when the sun went away, they closed down at night. And what he did was to put the plants in a dark closet. And then he opened the door of the closet the next morning, and he found out that the plant's leaves had raised up even though the organism was in constant darkness. And he realized at that point that living organisms had internal clocks which helped them to predict the changes that were going to occur in the external environment so that they'd be prepared, so that the leaves of the plant would be opened up when the sun came out, and they would then be able to absorb the sun's rays. as opposed to only responding to things after they happened. And we have the same kind of timing system in the body. We have an internal clock, and we call it a pacemaker, in the brain, which is the cluster of about 10,000 neurons, or nerve cells, that are together only the size of the head of a pin. But they send a signal to the rest of the body so that the body can anticipate changes in the external environment. And so, for example, certain hormones are released in anticipation of our waking. The so-called stress hormone cortisol begins to be released about 2 or 3 hours before we wake up in the morning, and it reaches its highest levels of the day by the time we wake up. Then it begins to drop down, and before we go to sleep at night, it's already at or near zero in anticipation of our going to sleep at night. So we have a timing system in the body, and it is organized to anticipate near 24-hour changes in our external environment.
So our biological clocks time the optimal or the sort of maximal sleep periods, or the primary sleep periods. When we want to sleep, we tend to sleep, we are sleepy, and that is often in conflict with our schedule, and then the results are an impairment of sleep-wake functions. And the degree of the conflict between clock and schedule more or less determines the severity of that impairment. But it exists for almost everybody.
One of the difficulties that shift workers face is that they're often trying to fight this internal timing system in the body, our internal time clock. And that clock is controlling the timing of the release of hormones, it's controlling when people are alert, it's controlling daily variations in performance, it's also controlling physiological cycles like the body temperature cycle and like the release of hormones. And so when a person is trying to fight this system, they really end up fighting their own body. So they're scheduled to work, let's say, from midnight till 8 o'clock in the morning. So they're struggling to stay awake, particularly in the wee hours of the morning at around 4, 5, and 6 in the morning. That's what I call the critical zone of vulnerability. That's when, for example, most of the major industrial accidents, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Bhopal, all occurred between the hours of 1 and 5 in the morning. And they were all attributed to some component of operator error in the generation of the accident. And that's when there's a 16-fold increase in the likelihood of having a single vehicle truck accident that is associated with falling asleep at the wheel. That's why I call it a zone of vulnerability. In the United States, at any given time, there are about 20 to 30 million people who have a variable work schedule, which means that they bounce back and forth between day shift and night shift. And it turns out that 1 out of 3 working men and 1 out of 4 working women are exposed to that kind of variable work schedule at some point during the course of a year. And we're just beginning to understand the consequences of those kinds of shift rotations on the body. One of the oldest occupations in which people have to work around the clock is in police work. And over this past 4 or 5 years, we've carried out a study with the Philadelphia Police Force to try to see if we could improve the work schedule of the policemen that had to cover the beat, as it were, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
I've worked shift work ever since I've been on the police department, and that's a little over 15 years. We work in Philadelphia a rotating shift. We work 6 days on, 2 days off. We work midnight till 8 in the morning. Then we switch to 4 in the afternoon until 12 midnight. Then we switch to 8 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. And we do that, we just rotate week by week.
He's always tired. He's in a state of tiredness most of the time. And I think it's just very hard for a human being to go to sleep in the daylight. And that's the hardest shift, midnight to 8. He has problems with that. The first day he may only sleep 4 hours. The next day he may sleep 6.
There are times that, this almost sounds over dramatic, but there are times when you sit and say, I can't work one more shift of midnight to 8, I just can't do it. And of course you do. But you just sometimes get so tired.
The first thing that we did was to evaluate their current work schedule. And the type of work schedule that they had involved the officers working for a week on day shift. And then they rotated in a counterclockwise direction of shift rotation. That is to say, to an earlier hour, and went from the day shift to the night shift, and the night shift to the evening shift. The second thing that we recommended was that they change the direction of shift rotation so that they went from day shift to evening shift, to a clockwise direction of shift rotation. The third thing that we did was to reduce the number of times that they changed shift so that we had them stay on steady shifts for several weeks at a time before switching to the evening shift. So the body had a little bit of a chance to adjust to one work schedule before it was immediately shifted to the next. And finally, and this is one of the most important changes that we made, we reduced the number of consecutive days in a row that they had to work. And that reduced the level of cumulative sleep deprivation that the policemen suffered.
The results from a physical point of view and from a psychological point of view, personally, I thought were tremendous.
And so we made those several small changes in the work schedule, and the improvements were remarkable. We found that the officers reported that they were able to sleep better when they were at work. The number of the officers that were reporting poor sleep problems was reduced in half. There was a 25% increase in their level of alertness during the daytime. Even their families were much happier. There was a 5-fold increase in the level of family satisfaction with the work schedule. Jet lag is another situation in which we need to adjust our internal clock. And the difficulty that we have in making that adjustment is what we experience as the malaise of being in another country, and we're trying to stay awake when everybody else is staying awake during the daytime, and we're overcome by bouts of fatigue, and we're trying to experience the daytime when everybody else is experiencing it in Europe or wherever, except our body is gearing us to be asleep, and that may manifest itself in a variety of ways. We may feel very tired. Our GI system, gastrointestinal upset may be a symptom. And then when we try to go to sleep at night in the new city, whether it's Tokyo or Paris, our body may be waking us up.
I don't actually find the trip itself too difficult, but after I've been there about 2 days, it begins to hit me of awakening at 3 o'clock in the morning and falling asleep or becoming very drowsy at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
And I just couldn't go on with it. I became depressed, general malaise, I couldn't think anymore. So my body and possibly my mind just didn't take it anymore.
My job as director of security takes me into situations where we're facing decisions involving personal safety, individual lives, the protection of corporate assets. And it's imperative that when I get there, I be able to make decisions quickly.
For 6 years, I thought everything was fairly normal. I felt fine. I've learned since, I guess, in talking with my wife that I had some irritability problems, which I didn't sense, I guess, at the time, which have since I've stopped traveling a great deal, have become evident. I mean, there's been some changes, I think, in the way that I go about doing things now.
So that's what jet lag means to a person. And what we're doing is we're beginning to do research to find out how exposure to either natural sunlight or artificial light that simulates sunlight can help us to prepare for a trip before we go, or to adjust to the trip once we've gotten there. And we have found through our experiments that we can adjust to any change in time zones within 3 days if we very properly time the exposure to external light and darkness.
Because the loss of sleep has so profound an effect on our lives, it is important to understand as much about this nightly ritual as possible. We know now that sleep is a state as important as wakefulness.
There always was a kind of notion that when you fall asleep, your brain turns off. Like turning off the ignition of an automobile. Nothing can go wrong with that automobile while it sits in the garage. You know, something tremendous is going on in the brain at that time, and it's beginning to be understood. The thing that's understood the best is that the brain actively blocks all of the motor outflow, and yet that motor outflow is occurring. The brain is elaborating movements for the body, and at the same time actively blocking them. At the same time elaborating dream stories. At the same time going through all sorts of metabolic processes that we don't even begin to understand. That process is active. It's orchestrated by the brain. The brain is actively disengaging from the real world. So waking brain, The major job is engagement with the waking world, and in a human being that's an enormously complex issue. The sleeping brain actively disengages from the waking world, and it can only be to deal with the inner world in a variety of ways.
As recently as the 1950s, most scientists agreed with the famous Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov that sleep was a kind of tuning down or even a tuning off. The discovery of rapid eye movement sleep, REM sleep, by Dr. Nathaniel Kleitman and a graduate student, Eugene Aserinsky, proved Pavlov wrong and demonstrated that the sleeping brain was charged with activity. In 1952, Dr. Dement, then a medical student, worked with Dr. Kleitman to define more precisely the architecture of sleep. They found that there are two distinct types of sleep, REM and non-REM sleep. From this beginning, much of our current understanding about sleep has emerged. Exactly what is REM sleep and what is its role in human development? Dr. Thomas Anders, Brown University.
It's an internal switch that turns us on at night, activates our brain, activates our physiological systems throughout the body in periodically recurring episodes. It turns us on to exercise certain systems. We know that brand newborn babies are not very susceptible to external stimulation. They don't see very well, they don't hear very much, they don't process a lot of information in early development. So how can their brains be stimulated to grow, since we know that information processing stimulates brains? How can an infant who is turned off to external stimulation, in effect, develop those kinds of brain pathways and mechanisms? The REM centers turned on and stimulated the brain from within rather than from without. And so the reason babies have that much REM sleep is it makes their brains grow. That's simplistic, but you could also say it makes synapses connect within the nervous system. It makes pathways connect up so that information in the brain that will eventually come in will have pathways to travel. When the REM center turns on inside our brain, the eyes move. That's the characteristic of REM sleep. The eyes move, but the pathways from the eye, from the retina of the eye, through the lateral geniculate body to the visual cortex in the back of our head light up like a Christmas tree. And those are the pathways which the baby uses when the baby is first born to attach to the mother. So as I see it now, REM sleep in early development helps the maturation of the visual system, which in turn enhances the opportunities for attachment and the well-being of the mother-infant relationship, which relates to the survival of the infant.
The infant, in the earliest days of its life, will sleep about 17 hours a day and will spend 7 or 8 hours awake. Of the time spent asleep, 50%, or about 8 hours, is REM sleep. A young adult of 20 or 21 sleeps about 8 hours each night. 20%, or about an hour and a half, is REM sleep. In old age, although the total time spent sleeping will decrease on average from 8 hours to 6 hours a night, the percentage of REM sleep, 20%, remains constant.
The most amazing gap in our knowledge is the moment of sleep. No one knows for sure what the neural events are. That 1 minute you can see, I can see you now, then I have a microsleep, let's say, or 2 seconds from now I'm asleep, I'm suddenly blind, deaf, disengaged totally from the real world. What happened in my brain to accomplish that? And at what level? Did something come down to the retina? Is it back in the visual cortex? Is it somewhere else? How does the whole brain regulate itself? Where in the brain are the decisions made that I will sleep at this part of time, I'll be awake at that part of time, and I'll have REM sleep at this moment, and I'll have non-REM sleep at this moment? And where's the real master of all this?
Questions. And because we are now able to chart the nocturnal journey, we continue to discover some interesting facts about the way we sleep. Each night's sleep begins with about 90 minutes of non-REM sleep, during which brain waves gradually lengthen through 4 stages. Stage 1 is a transitional stage between wakefulness and slumber. Thoughts wander and little dreams may occur. In the second stage, we are unequivocally asleep. Stage 4 usually terminates with a posture shift. Brainwaves now reverse their course, and the sleeper proceeds to the first REM period of the night. Non-REM sleep is punctuated by increasingly longer REM periods with 90-minute cycles throughout the night. During REM sleep, the eyes move while the body remains still, and the central nervous system is engaged in a display of physiology so intense that it has been called a third state of earthly existence. Heart rate, breathing, and blood pressure become irregular. Muscles may twitch, but the sleeper is, for all practical purposes, paralyzed. After about 20 minutes of REM sleep, we stir and drift back into non-REM sleep in a cycle that repeats itself throughout the night. There is still much to be learned about REM sleep. As studies continue, our knowledge and understanding of this subject may provide the key to other areas related to sleep, such as dreams and dreaming.
Originally, I know I had some kind of glib notion that if we could study dreaming directly, we'd have insights into primarily mental illness. And there was a kind of a view that the dream is a waking, that is, psychosis is a waking dream, and that the dream had all of the seeds of psychosis. And as a matter of fact, in my opinion, that's still a loose end in psychiatry. To what extent the processes that underlie dreaming are also the processes that underlie hallucination in the waking state.
We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Shakespeare links dreams with the very essence of life. Dr. Rosalind Cartwright, Rush Presbyterian, St. Luke's Medical Center, Chicago.
Why we dream, the function of dreaming, and even what they mean have been big areas of controversy in this field over the 30 or so odd years that we've been staying up nights to record them in the laboratories. There are people who say they're just garbage. They're the flotsam and jetsam that needs to be hauled away at night to leave room for more important material to be stored in memory in the next day, that they're a way of sort of clearing the computer space, and therefore they're meaningless. Now, I'm not one of those, as you might imagine. I think they're highly meaningful and very personal, and that they are a little bit hard for us to read ourselves. They're almost like the difference between reading poetry and reading prose. We speak prose all day, and we speak poetry at night. It's highly symbolized, condensed, very rich, very imagistic language. And it's a language that many of us have forgotten how to speak. We learned it when we were young. We developed those images that stand for emotional experiences when we're quite young. The falling dream is one that almost everybody has persistently through life, but starts very early at about 3 years of age. Dreams of social embarrassment, dreams of glory, flying, floating, playing the piano without ever taking a lesson, or performing brain surgery without ever going to medical school. Those kind of dreams, they're common. They develop pretty early, and each of us has a kind of symbol language we build up to express anxieties, hopes and fears, and we repeat them in a variety of ways across our lifespan. Dreams are hallucinations, fantasy experiences that we have regularly, every night, multiple times. We know we can describe them. We know something of the landscape of the night, how often they occur, that they get more and more exciting as the night goes on, typically, that they get more and more remote in terms of pulling on earlier memories as the night goes on, and that they often have a single theme from the beginning to the end of the night, almost like chapters in a book with a whole novel being written across the night. I've been chasing the function of dreaming for a long time. That question, are they good for anything? Are they just illustrative, like the pictures at night of the text of our lives? And I decided that the best way to go after a function would be to take people who were in some kind of stress, undergoing some kind of life event that required a change in their emotional life, that would require work of the kind that we think dreams might be involved with, emotional information processing. So I chose divorce as a kind of common trauma, life event that no one goes through without some storm and stress and trouble. And I've been studying males and females going through the breakup of a first marriage, looking at both their sleep and their dreaming to see whether it's working well or working badly. Under a life stress, does this function break down, stop working, or does it go into high gear and do something different than it does under everyday circumstances?
So I look out at this building and I see the second one, and it's very high, and it's sloping, and it has this sense of risk and of sliding off it. Comes up for me. And my own interpretation of this dream is that, and what sits with me is just owning my own fear of going through another marriage again.
He had a dream in which he looks out his window, his real office window, at two buildings, one which is close by, which is his present marriage, and then a second building which he identified as a possible new marriage, building an ideal castle in the air, if you like, or he describes it as a castle in a fantasy. It's very bright, it's shiny, it's beautiful, it has sloping roof, it's somewhat dangerous. Now, that comes from both his present work, which is real estate, so he thinks in terms of building imagery, but also from fairy tale castles from the past. He puts together old images and present images to express something of his feelings of a relationship has to be built, and so that's a very concrete thing to build a building. And dreams are terribly literal as well as being figurative.
It was a very beautiful building.
Yes.
And it's higher than the second one. So in some ways it's more attractive. I noticed that. And I remember saying to a friend of mine recently that I want twice as much happiness to make up for all of this pain. So I'm looking for something better next time. I know that. But still the fear is there.
We've missed a lot of data by just looking at patients or looking at people during their waking lives and ignoring their sleeping lives, assuming that everything is fine. If you're sleeping, you're okay. Not necessarily so.
Slowly, surely, we gather new knowledge and new information that suggests that there are still more questions that must be asked and answered. Dr. Stephen LaBerge, Stanford University, on the subject of lucid dreaming.
Freud is the principal proponent of the idea that dreams are disguised because they represent unacceptable impulses, and that somehow every dream is some altered message, and that it's a message to ourselves. And my view of it is that that's not really correct. I see them instead as improvisations that are really constructed as an interplay between the conscious and unconscious minds as we go throughout the experience of the dream. It can't be that the function of dreams is a message, because the great majority of dreams are forgotten and could not have been remembered by non-linguistic mammals. So instead we have to look deeper, I think, for more biological purposes of dreaming. There may be many different functions that dreaming serves. But I would say, if you were to ask me, why do we dream? It's for the same reason that we construct representations of our environment and of models of reality at all. It's because it serves survival. That's what nervous systems are for. The particular line of work I've taken to approaching studying the dream state has been to have people become conscious while they are dreaming. So it sounds paradoxical, but they're still asleep. They're in REM sleep ordinarily, yet they know that they're dreaming, so they can remember to carry out experiments that you might ask them to do before they go to bed. So you could ask them to move their eyes in a particular pattern. That would then signal to you on the polygraph that you know that they're dreaming. And I think we're at the stage now where lucid dreaming is we're just discovering that it's possible, and just now beginning to learn how, once you realize you're dreaming, how can you have particular things happen. So how you can visit particular people, as it were. So if you have, let's say, unfinished business with a dead parent, well, you should be able to then in your lucid dream visit a representation of that parent and have an encounter that could well be therapeutic. But we're just now learning what are the techniques that you can use to do things in the dream state. Dreams can be a very flexible tool for exploring the way we construct a world of any kind. So I think it has a great deal of importance to cognitive psychology, to understanding how minds work in general.
Dr. Robert McCarley at Harvard Medical School is studying the neurophysiology of the brain during sleeping and dreaming.
One of the things that we have learned in studying the basic neurophysiology of the brain during sleep is that various brain centers are activated during dreaming sleep, during REM sleep. So what we know is from recordings is that motor commands for motor activity are being given during dreams. And we think that part of the dream information that's put together to form a dream comes from the stimulation of brain motor areas. And we've discovered that this clock turns on when certain sets of cells in the pontine reticular formation become active, become more excitable, and this excitation is then propagated to other areas of the brain, stimulating other areas. Now, one question that comes up is that each nerve cell uses a particular kind of chemical to send a message from itself to another cell. Is there a dream chemical, or is there a chemical that's associated with dreaming sleep? And we know something now of the answer, and the answer is that one of the chemicals that's clearly important is called acetylcholine. This is one of the brain's neurotransmitters. And compounds that mimic the effect of acetylcholine, or acetylcholine itself, induce powerful episodes of dreaming sleep, either in humans or in animals. First of all, I like to think is that mind and body are one. And this is a very comfortable position for a psychiatrist who's a physiologist also. The other kinds of implications are that this very complex state of dreaming has relatively simple biological mechanisms for turning it on. We don't know it all yet, but we're learning enough about this complex state to understand how the brain is able to control its own input and how the brain is able to generate its own world. So we're learning the mechanisms for a very complex transformation of sensory experience and also of brain state.
A dream is real while it lasts. Can we say more of life? And the answer is we can't.
But we can explore the reasons why, for too many of us, sleep is an elusive blessing. Today, there may be over 40 million Americans who suffer from a wide range of sleep disorders, which we call insomnia. Dr. Herman Nino Murcia, Stanford University School of Medicine.
insomnia becomes a terrible monster, a terrible disease. It's amazing to see many of the patients that I see in my clinic telling me that insomnia dominates their entire lives. They sell their houses, they move to a different town, they change jobs, they give up certain pursuits, they change all kinds of things. Insomnia then not only becomes a problem for the individual, but it becomes a major problem for the entire family. These people, when insomnia become obsessed, they will do anything in order to get rid of the insomnia, only to realize that the harder they try to solve the problem, the worse their insomnia becomes. So then they develop performance anxiety. Their bed becomes a battleground rather than a place for a delicious, cozy sleep. They go to bed to perform a task, to take an examination, to see how they do, not to relax and let the sleep come to you naturally. This performance anxiety further complicates the problem, make them more insomniacs. And of course, as the night passes, the more they realize that they are not asleep, and they become very nervous about that. They start counting the number of hours left in bed, and the more and more they think about it, the more upset they become. They are frightened.
Okay, well, I go to bed, like I said, these days. I normally don't have too much trouble going to sleep. Go to bed about 11, 3:45, 4 o'clock, I'm awake. I guess I've just had enough rest. My mind is sharp then, I'm alert, rested a little bit, and then I'll start reviewing either what happened that day, somebody didn't follow through with something which created a problem for me. You're so dependent on other people.
Patients don't often identify this as a problem that they volunteer, and it comes up if you ask. But they sleep or they don't sleep, and they don't necessarily see that as a health problem. I do.
The kinds of problems which are most common are not being able to fall asleep at night, getting up in the middle of the night, or getting up early. And they have a lot of reasons for them, all easy to deal with. Sometimes it's a depression. It could very well be that you've gotten into some kind of a negative feedback in your own system. You have to be able to deal with that. There's a frequent circumstance where a patient begins to feel uneasy about their sleep pattern, and they try to solve this pattern by themselves. They may take an extra shot of whiskey at bedtime, or they may go out and buy something over the counter, and may be using inappropriate means to solve a problem that they really don't understand the cause of. They will thus precipitate a chronic condition which is harder to cure, than solving the acute one, which the physician could have solved appropriately.
Well, it's worth paying attention to in the sense that it's a factor in that person's well-being. And any factor in a person's well-being we're interested in dealing with. And we're really, as family physicians, more interested in dealing with problems while they're small rather than only when they're big. So if we can help a person with a short-term problem, it's worth doing.
If you understand the seriousness of sleep disorders and the need for sleep and the need to function with good sleep patterns, then you'll understand that it's really worth getting it solved appropriately at the beginning than to prolong the misery and take a half a cure or perhaps a no cure or perhaps something which will aggravate the condition. So I'm very much in favor of having sleep disorders controlled appropriately by physicians rather than let the patient put a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
Through positron emission tomography, PET, we observe the living brain, and this eye of modern science helps us learn more about what is happening during sleep. Dr. Monty Buxbaum, the University of California at Irvine.
This is the first time positron emission tomography has been applied to the study of sleep deprivation. So we'll be able to see what brain areas are actually affected by fatigue, and this will give us important hints about what brain areas may be important in sleep itself. It's been widely found that patients with depression have abnormalities of sleep. They sleep poorly, but perhaps even more interestingly, the appearance of dreaming comes much earlier in the night. In the normal person, the first dream appears within an hour and a half to 2 hours. In many patients with depression, dreams may appear in 20 or 30 minutes. And we're interested in what makes this early appearance of dreaming and whether or not this may be related in some interesting way to changes in the poor sleep pattern that occur with depression. We wanted to look at the effects in normal individuals of a loss of a night of sleep, and we expect to see fatigue, poor performance on the visual task, and perhaps some decreases in metabolism in the very brain regions used to do that task in the right frontal cortex. In patients with depression, there are two interesting contrasts. One is patients with depression seem to have lower rates of glucose metabolism in this same area. The other interesting thing is that there have been experimental studies suggesting that if you keep patients with depression up all night, that the next day they have a sudden alleviation of their depressive syndrome. So we sort of anticipate seeing that in the normal individuals there may be a decrease in frontal lobe metabolism, whereas in the patients with affective disorder we might actually see an antidepressant effect or an elevation of metabolism in this region. In the patient that we studied who was asleep, we then moved him into the scanner and developed, in a sense, the picture that was occurring during rapid eye movement sleep. And what we saw, somewhat to our surprise, in this individual who's actively dreaming, we can see high activity in the frontal regions, in the temporal and frontal cortex, areas involved perhaps in the planning and organization of activity, and perhaps in imagination or other right brain functions. The visual areas of the brain are relatively less active here in the back of the head. In this subject, sleeping but not dreaming, we see actually more activity in the visual regions and activities of high glucose metabolism scattered across the cortex. So it seems as if during rapid eye movement sleep, or sometimes called paradoxical sleep, the brain is really in an alert and vigilant state, similar to that one might see in a person who was awake and attending actively. Well, it is a drama. When we did the first dream sleep with a pet that anyone had ever seen, we had a whole audience of people out here, even in the middle of the night. Everyone wanted to see what would happen during a dream. And I think it is one of the most exciting areas in the neurosciences to probe inner space, in a sense, to sail on a voyage into the inner parts of the brain and see what happens in dreaming and the other mental states that we all encounter.
It's sort of like we're on a new continent, and every time we've looked closely at some function, we've discovered pathology. So the breathing has been examined the most closely. Cardiac function is beginning to be examined. We could look at digestive functions in much more detail. We sort of go on and on. And as we know much more about immunology, for example, I'm sure we're going to find relationships between the sleeping brain and immune functions, and then pathologies. You know, there's nothing that we do that doesn't have a pathology. And it's just a matter of realizing that the sleeping brain is active, that it carries out functions, and that things can go wrong. And they do. And you know, say they do in hundreds of millions of Americans, and then perhaps, God, how many around the world? It's awesome.
The pathology of sleep, diseases related to sleep or sleep deprivation, is becoming a major focus of research. When things go wrong with sleep, the result can be catastrophic for the individual and for the family.
If we discuss sleep disorders medicine, I think that the first thing I would say is very young specialty. And one illness, narcolepsy, has been known a long time. The notion of sleep fulfilling its function and keeping you alert is a major issue. In the case of narcolepsy, the sleep process which promotes alertness isn't functioning, and the REM sleep mechanisms aren't functioning.
Narcoleptics tend to go directly from wakefulness into dreaming sleep, or components of dreaming sleep tend to burst in upon wakefulness. And the way this is characterized in narcoleptics is muscle collapses or intrusions into wakefulness of frightening hallucinatory experiences.
He said he can't wake up.
The principal diagnostic test for narcolepsy is to look for an abnormal transition from wakefulness into rapid eye movement or dreaming sleep. And we do this by asking people to fall asleep in the laboratory 4 or 5 times a day at regular intervals and watching the kind of sleep that follows. Normals will rarely have rapid eye movement sleep during daytime naps, 20 or 30 minutes long. But narcoleptics will have 2 to perhaps 5 experiences of going directly from wakefulness into REM sleep, or with only a little bit of non-REM sleep intervening.
This first started occurring when I was in the Army, and it wasn't recognized then. I was punished for it. And, you know, it went on through the years, and I just lived with it, and it wasn't recognized because
That you just lazy and stuff.
people thought I was just sleepy, and they'd make jokes, and I was called Sleeping Beauty in the Army. When I came home from the Army, it was real bad then. For years, I slept, and the world was in little pieces. So I did a lot of hiding so that people wouldn't bother me, because if I had a seizure, if I laughed at that time, if I laughed too much or got excited in any way, I'd have seizures, and then I was conscious of what's happening, and people would think I was an epileptic. They'd stick sticks in my mouth, spoons in my mouth, take my clothes off, put ice all on me and everything, and it'd be hard to come out of it then because I would be under so much pressure. So I would just, sometimes, you know, I'd be getting really abused, and I just, you know, say, I'm not here, you know, they're not here.
But once the information about narcolepsy is at hand, the problems can be reduced, particularly with treatment, can be reduced to severe annoyances as opposed to disabling symptoms.
Sleep apnea is a sleep disorder where people stop breathing in their sleep. Essentially, they fall asleep, they stop breathing, and then in order to start breathing, they have to wake up again. So they wake up, they start breathing, they go back to sleep, they stop breathing, and this cycle continues for periods throughout the night. By definition, we say there have to be at least 30 apneas a night, or 5 per hour of sleep, each lasting a minimum of 10 seconds. Anything less than that is considered normal because we all stop breathing once in a while in our sleep. But in fact, what we see clinically is that people may stop breathing for a minute or a minute and a half, even 2 minutes each time they have an apnea. And they may occur not 30 times a night, but 500 or 600 times a night. What happens is their daytime functioning is affected because they are excessively sleepy, and they tend to fall asleep at inappropriate times. They'll fall asleep while sitting around with friends and talking. I had one patient who reported she used to fall asleep while singing in choir, clearly an inappropriate time. I had another patient who was a house painter and would fall asleep while painting the house. These people might fall asleep while driving, certainly while sitting at their desk trying to work, while eating, while talking, perhaps even during sex. And certainly anytime they sit down quietly, they fall asleep. And so their daytime functioning is disturbed by all the awakenings that occur during the night. Sleep apnea is primarily a male disorder. The ratio of male to female is about 30-to-1 until females reach menopause. And then once females are post-menopause, it seems to be common in females as well. There are other side effects of sleep apnea as well. Cardiac arrhythmias or heart disease are very common in people with sleep apnea. Hypertension is very common in people with sleep apnea. And these are things that may not show up in the daytime. If you go to your doctor during the day and he checks your heart, it may look perfectly fine. It's only at night or while you're asleep that the arrhythmias show up.
What lies ahead in our ongoing research into the secrets of sleep? Dr. Alan Rechtschaffen, the University of Chicago.
I think modern sleep research has shown that sleep is a highly organized process that is not simply less of wakefulness, it is different from wakefulness. And those differences are actively produced. The answers to the why and the how of sleep will be of importance to the area of physical and mental health. There's some strong evidence suggestive of this. On the physical side, we know that people who sleep either very little, less than 4 hours a night, or people who sleep a great deal, more than 10 hours a night, have higher mortality rates than people who sleep the normal 7 or 8 hours of sleep. And so that sleep in some way is related to longevity. So sleep ultimately will be important for issues of physical health. With respect to mental health, there are definite links there. We know that in certain mental disorders, such as depression, the sleep patterns are dramatically changed. We think that sleep has an absolutely vital function because we sacrifice so much to sleep. Namely, we don't protect our young, we don't gather food, we don't do all of the important things that we don't have enough time to do when we're awake. If sleep is so expensive that if it doesn't have a vital function, it's probably the greatest mistake that evolution has ever made.
The past 2 decades have brought us exciting new knowledge about sleep. We know now that it is as important to our lives as the waking state. And we also know that there are still uncharted regions of knowledge that we must continue to explore. Sleep. Fascinating, complex, an essential and infinitely valuable part of our lives. This program is made possible by a grant from the Upjohn Company, a worldwide research-based provider of human healthcare products and services.
This is PBS.